guys are exactly, it's being recorded. So if you guys are following along at home, don't feel like you have to keep up. We're going to send you guys a link to it shortly. And without further ado, Amy, are you ready?
Hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me today for our little lunchtime demo. I'm very excited to be a part of the Art in Bloom festivities virtually this year. I have been in person before. This year's a little different, but yeah, I'm just excited that y'all are here. This is probably the biggest class I've ever spoken in front of. So thank you for being here. A little bit about me. Let me see here. I'm just gonna, there we go. So a little bit about me. I am an art educator and watercolorist. I just moved east of Raleigh, so I moved out a little bit, but still in the Triangle. I work from my home studio, and I teach watercolor classes. I will be going back into in-person teaching again soon, but for the last year, I have been teaching virtually, and so I'm very used to this format. And I'm just grateful you're here today. So we're gonna go over some really basic things today, and we'll have, the chat will be open and available to you, but also know that I'm gonna be going over a lot of information, so questions you might have might be covered in the future. I will leave things open at the end for a few minutes. If you have questions for me about watercolor or being a working artist or really anything, you may hear the pitter patter of feet. 4 paws on the floor. I have 3 dogs, maybe some collars, don't mind that. One of the benefits of working from home. So yeah, with all that being said, we're gonna go ahead and get started. A little bit about my background. So I did go to school for art education, so I'm very versed in like the psychology behind art making and how we learn art and to make art from all ages. And I just released my first children's book, and I also have kits and guides on how to use watercolor on my website, and all that information will go in the chat, at least by the end. So anyway, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So I'm actually going to plug in my, what I call my hands camera. So I'm gonna do that now. Where is that? Okay. Doesn't like for me to plug it in early. So I'm gonna switch over to that. Here we go. Just give me a second. We're all used to these technical things by now, right? Sometimes it likes for me to plug it in. There it goes, a couple times. All right, so now you are going to see my camera and my hands here. Hello, here I am. All right, so the first thing we're gonna talk about is we're gonna talk about all the materials we're gonna need to get started today. And so my favorite thing to talk about is the paint. So we're gonna start with that. So you may have purchased my kit online or from the museum, and that kit contains one of these cake pans, okay? So this looks a lot like what we used as kids in school, but it's actually permanent paint with really vibrant colors. And so there's this kind. You also may be using tube paints today. Also remember that because this is recorded, you can go back and watch it as many times as you like. So if you miss something, you can always go back and rewatch it. This is actually liquid watercolor, and this is my all-time favorite to use because of its vibrancy. And so I'm gonna be using all of these today just to kind of show you how they work. Yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I've got my palette. This is where I'm gonna be mixing my paint. This is just a plastic one you can get at any art store. I think even Walmart carries these. I always have a nice big jar of water, clean water. I've got some test strips. So I often cut my paper down to size. I like to work anywhere from like 5x7 to 8x10. I like to make small work. And so I always have these strips laying around. And then I've got my watercolor paper. This is just student grade paper, cold press paper. The difference between cold press paper and hot press paper is that cold press paper has some toothiness to it. It has some texture, okay? And that catches the watercolor and the pigment in a different way from hot press paper, which is very, very smooth. Now, why would you want to use hot press paper? If you were wanting to scan work after you create it and have no kind of like shadowy divots from this texture and this paper, then you might want to use hot press paper. If you wanted to use multimedia, say go over your watercolor with some colored pencils and not have that pencil lead get stuck in those little crevices of the paper, then you might want to use hot press paper. But for most of my life, I've used cold press. I've also got round brushes here. Round brushes are the most versatile for watercolor. I have lots of different sizes. This is a 14. This brush brand is my favorite. It's called Polar Flow. So I've got a variety here, but honestly, I use my big brush the most. And the more versatile you can get, the better you can get with a larger brush, the less you have to change out your brushes and then load it up with paint while you're working. When you get in flow, the better. So I always, in my classes with my students, we always really just use a size 14 or 12 round brush. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and start activating our paint. So I'm gonna start with the cake pan kit here. So this is a semi-moist cake pan, which means that like it's always a little bit tacky. I'm not gonna touch it, but if I were to touch it, it's a little bit tacky to the touch. So I'm just gonna activate this red. It's a really more orangey red. So what I'm gonna do here, so this is like kind of a common misconception. I'm not gonna paint from this kit. I'm actually going to transfer my paint over into my palette. Just like so. And I'm just putting a little bit on the edge of my brush and I'm just scraping it on the side here. All right. So that's the paint I'm gonna use from that kit. Maybe I'll use some yellow too. I've got a little green in here, but that's all right. I'm just scraping on the side. Just like so. Notice I haven't added, aside from activating the color, the semi-moist pan with some water, I haven't added any water to this yet, and there's a reason for that. All right, now I'm gonna dip into my tube paint. So a common question I get, how much paint should I use? So I always say with these tube paints, and this could vary from person to person, I would say like 1/3 or 1/4 of what you might squeeze out onto your toothbrush. Like I said, that's definitely gonna vary on your dental hygiene. But it comes out a little bit like toothpaste. And so, oops, not adding water yet. I should also add that I always keep paper towels nearby. All right, so then I'm going to squeeze out some of my liquid watercolors. And you're like, liquid watercolors, don't we add water to it anyways? Yes. So think of the liquid watercolor, it's similar to like using food coloring in baking, okay? So it is liquid already, but you still have to add water to it in order to thin it down. Okay, so now that I've got my colors out, now I'm gonna go back in to my water, and I'm gonna load up my brush with water. See how it's drippy? And I'm just going to add probably 7 or 8 drops of water to each color. This might vary. This isn't an end-all be-all addition of water. It's just to get it started. Notice I haven't mixed anything. And part of that is because if I were to go ahead and mix everything at once, it's gonna make my water dirty really quick, and then I'm gonna have to change it immediately. All right, so I'm just gonna let that sit for a second. All right, so those colors are activated. And next, I'm gonna do my watercolor warm-up. Now, before I get started, oh, I think I have a little spider friend visiting. Before I get started, I wanna say this. The ratio to water to pigment is like the biggest learning curve. So if you don't get that today, if you don't get that within 6 months, that's okay. It takes time and it takes practice. And I have a lot of people say, well, how, oh, there's my little spider. People say, well, how can I get better at that? And the honest truth is just practice, practice, practice. That really is just the way. So yeah, so I'm gonna get my paper. So I've got my paint. So the next thing I wanna do, and I always do, because believe it or not, I don't paint every day in my business. I wish I did. I would say it's about 30% painting, 70% everything else. So the next thing I do is I wanna warm up, okay? Because sometimes I haven't painted in a week. And so I always need to get warmed up. And so I call this my watercolor warm up. I've also got this on my YouTube channel for free for reference. There's a couple different things on there for people to watch. And so I like to start, so notice that I have my paper turned horizontally, and that is so I have the most real estate to drag that brush across, okay? So the first brush stroke I'm gonna make is a really wide stroke. I'm gonna really put a lot of pressure on that brush. It's at about a 45-degree angle. And I'm just gonna start with my wide stroke. And so if you see here on the end where, I'm gonna try to zoom in. Down. So if you see here on the end where there might be some white showing through, that's called dry brushing. And that is a technique within itself. It's not something we're gonna go over today. But all that means is that you need a little more liquid, a little more pigment on your brush. That is what that indicates. So I'm just gonna actually go over that. All right, so then, scoot this back over. So then I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going to do the thinnest stroke I can do. So for this stroke, I'm really gonna choke up my fingers, more like a pencil on that brush so I can have more control, okay? Just scooting this out a little bit. And I'm going to very lightly, as light as I can, with a little more precision, I'm gonna see how thin of a stroke I can make. And one of the things that this does is it shows you, it demonstrates the versatility within one brush. Okay, I do a lot of pet portraiture, and you know, when I'm in my groove and I'm working on these pet portraits, if I have to switch between brushes to a smaller brush to do hairs versus a wash, and that gets me out of my groove. All right, so the next stroke is a combination, I call it the snail trail. Can you tell I taught preschool at one point? And it combines the thick and the thin strokes together. So I'm gonna start thick. Oh, I need to load it up a little bit more. So I start thick, and I'm gonna relieve the pressure. So notice what happens when I put pressure on that brush. All the bristles spread across the page. And I usually do at least 2 of these strokes of each style when I'm warming up. And we actually do these warm-ups, of some variation of these warm-ups in every class. And sometimes my students are like, oh, you know, we're doing this again. And I'm like, well, you know, you wouldn't say like, well, I'm never doing jumping jacks again before a workout because I've done them before to warm my body up, right? That's all we're doing. We're warming up our fine motor skills and that side of our brain to prepare ourselves for some creativity. All right, so thick, thin, snail trail. And then we're gonna switch gears a little bit and we're going to do a vertical stroke. And so I'm gonna start from the top and I'm going to just make stripes going down. Now, depending on the angle and the pressure, you can make thinner stripes or you can make your angle a little more dramatic and make thicker stripes. Halfway across, I'm gonna flip the script here and I'm gonna do a flick stroke. So similar motion, right? Similar vertical motion, totally different stroke. a lot of watercolor painting is just building on foundational skills. And this is used a lot for grass. I painted a lot of grass for my children's book because a big chunk of it was outside. Okay, so we've got our, I call this the vertical stroke, and then the reverse of that is the flick stroke. Then I'm going to do a scallop. I'm going to start tight. And as I come across the page, I'm going to go wide. Just a scallop. Then I'm going to do a zigzag. Y'all, I've got to laugh because this spider has literally like taken up residence here. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it's becoming the star of the show. He's more cute and scary. I'm a big garden person, so I don't mind. I don't mind that he's hanging with us today for our lunchtime lesson. All right, and then I'm gonna do a dotted stroke. And I'm gonna switch colors here. I'm gonna switch to a pink. Just realized I was doing all green. So I'm just loading up some pink paint. What you don't want to see on your brush, and this happens more with the tube colors, is you don't ever want to see, for lack of better words, chunks on your brush. You don't want chunks of paint. It's not acrylic paint, or it's not like oils. You should see a little bit of color on the brush, but no thickness of the paint. So I'm going to do a dotted stroke or a dash stroke, and then I'm going to practice doing some dots. Maybe I'm making them bigger as I go. And so even just a simple exercise like this daily or every other day can really improve your brush handling skills, and it'll boost your confidence for sure. All right, so the last thing I'm going to show you is the comma stroke, and it is also great for petals. So it's very applicable here. So it is probably the trickiest one of all of these, but it gets its name because of how it looks on the page. So basically I am doing a smush and a swoop. So see how it looks like a comma shape? It's a smush and a swoop. I'm not really going a very far distance when I move my brush, and that is sort of the secret to it. So I'm really smushing down, and then I'm sort of just letting those bristles come back together. That's how we get those nice tips. Smush, swoop. Smush, swoop. All right, and I sort of ran out of room there. But you can do as many pages as you want. Sometimes we do just like a little free form exercise. I know for me personally, even though I've been using watercolor sort of exclusively for 10 years, I still sort of come to my blank page with the same jitters every time. That sort of never goes away. Same with teaching. I love teaching. I'm very comfortable teaching, but I sort of have a little stage fright every time. So with that being said, sometimes it's just fun to get those jitters out and just get that brush moving on the page and just do some sort of mark making for mark making's sake. So this can be another part of your warm up. And then I might add colors. Might just drop some wet into wet here and just see what happens. Oftentimes my favorite things that I make are more intuitive and less intentional. These colors sort of have like a watermelon vibe going on. So I just made some scribbles basically. And that sort of just like gets the anxiety of creating out of your fingertips. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna move on, and we're gonna start first by talking about what I consider like a daisy style flower. And I am gonna take a little sip of my sparkling water because I'm parched. Let's see. Just taking a peek at the chat. Okay, I see, Ollie. All right. So Ollie, I also don't mind if you want to ask questions. Yes, that's right, Melissa. Sparkling water all summer long. If you want to read questions to me out loud, I don't mind. If not, no big deal. I can answer questions and paint at the same time. My students will often say, "How can you paint and talk at the same?" And I'm like, I've never really thought about it. I've always been a chatterbox. All right. So daisy style flower. So before we dive right into the full flower shape, I want to talk about petals, okay? So really a petal is just a combination of two strokes coming together. So 1, 2. Once again, you're seeing that, I'm going to be dramatic here. You're seeing that smoosh come back together. See how the bristles fan out, and then as I relieve pressure, I'm doing like slow-mo here, they come back together. That's sort of what we're looking for here, okay? And then I've got some pigment kind of sitting, you know, in certain places, and some people like that and some people don't. Often my students sort of like panic in those moments. This sort of watercolor-ish look here is what I love about watercolor, but if you don't like it, you could just go over it again. I think it's what makes things look dynamic. All right, so with that being said, we're just using those two strokes, right? We can do lots of different types of petals, which will give us a lot of different types of look for the same flower style, okay? So I'm gonna do my little circle. Well, I guess we'll just make it yellow. Yellow can be tricky. This yellow has some orange in it, some red in it. Yellow can be tricky because it doesn't like to show up very well, like lemon yellow on white. Almost looks like fluorescent. So I'm just going to do some basic petals coming into this. I'm going to let it bleed. And you'll note that it's a little bit trickier because I've got my camera set up here. Let's see if I can scoot things over a little bit. You'll note that I'm turning my page as I work. And what that does is it keeps you from getting, I call this the butt of your hand. We've all done it, right? We've been like drawing with pencils and we've put our hand in our paper. Sometimes, like in art school, I know I used to use newsprint to put under that part of my hand. So we don't want to put the butt of our hand through our painting. Inevitably it happens, okay? So this is just a basic daisy style using those two-stroke petals. Now I kind of lost the yellow. That's okay. So one thing I can do is I can go back in. I just washed my brush off and dried it a little bit. I can use my brush to lift like a sponge. See how much paint just came up there? And then when this dries a little bit, or I'll just do it now for the sake of time, I can come back in and add paint. So lifting is a technique. You can use a semi-dry clean brush. You can use a paper towel as like a little more dramatic, a little less control. Okay, so this is the daisy style flower. So here's the deal though. We can do a lot of different looks. So we can do a smaller center and longer, thinner petals, right? So that gives us, I immediately have to turn it. So that gives us a totally different look, more of like an aster. So same idea with the 2-stroke petal. We're just changing the length and the thickness of the petal. And you get, oh, the spider's on me now, so he's got to go. But you get a totally different look of a flower, right? So in that vein, you can also, so here we've changed the center, circumference, diameter. I know math, all right. We've changed the center diameter, and we've also changed the thickness and the length of the petals. So you can do the same thing. You can do a bigger center. Do a really big center, like a sunflower, let's say. And I'm gonna do this red color. So here I'm just loading my brush up. And we can do wider petals, wider, rounder petals. So we're sort of just doing kind of generic, that's why I say like daisy style flower today. I go into more in-depth flower types in my Florals book, which I will put the link to. There's a PDF version, there's a printed version you can order. And so once again, really similar techniques, but just by changing just small things here and there, petal length, petal width, diameter of the center of the flower, you get totally different looks, right? I mean, I think it's Lisa Congdon. She's an illustrator, a very famous illustrator out of Portland. And she has a book called like How to Paint a Tulip 100 Different Ways. So this is sort of like, you know, a fun activity for you for practice even might be to see like how many different styles of daisies can you make just by changing up small attributes of the daisy. All right, so that is our daisy style flower, and we're at about 12:30, just as I like to do time checks while I'm teaching. And the next flower we're gonna do is a little more complicated, and it's what I call a rosette style flower. And depending on the colors you're using, so basically I'm using, we'll do a little color theory real quick. Basically I'm using complementary colors today because I'm using red and green, and they're across from each other on the color wheel. So sometimes when I'm using complements, my water gets dirtier quicker. And so you might need to change your water if it's looking a little muddy. But for as dirty as my water looks right now, I'll show you. You can always do a little test, right? I mean, you really can't even see that on the screen, right? So a little water test is good too. All right, so now I'm gonna do the rosette style. So I'm gonna zoom in here. Spider's back. And be our mascot for our class. 'Cause he's like, you're painting flowers, you're painting my natural habitat. I shall join you. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with the very tip of my brush. I'm gonna make a little, just sort of curlicue. So a little swirl, okay? Note that like, it's not a perfect line. Okay, but you can't be on the paper, spider. It's not a perfect line, okay? It's got some thickness to it. Okay, so I like to work in like odd numbers for petals for these because it keeps it from looking too symmetrical. Our brains sort of have this thing, I think because we see patterns so often, like in clothing, on poster, I mean, patterns everywhere if you really think about it. So I'm doing these petals on the outside. So I like to start with 3. And I'm creating them in such a way that they wrap around each other and that center. And I'm gonna do several of these, okay? All right, so I've got sort of those first 3. You'll notice a couple things. The thickness on the edge of the petal versus towards the center. It's thinner on the outside and thicker, it's thinner on the outside and thicker towards the inside. So sort of like a crescent. See how it's kind of like a crescent moon? And I like to sort of move my brush because I like for the edge to have some texture to it. Notice I haven't picked up more paint. And what this does is it allows for like a natural like ombre gradation thing to sort of happen. And if I touch this edge to this wet edge, I'm creating a channel, right? So that pigment is going to travel into this petal here. So I'm going to come out here. See, I'm still moving my brush. This one's a little light, so I'm just going to come back in and touch my brush over it. We're always trying to get the most out of our brush stroke. So you really want the brush to do its job. And I'll show you what I mean by that more detailed here in a second. And so you kind of just decide like how full do I want this to be? Maybe I want it to be heavier on the bottom so it looks like it's at an angle. And so that is the rosette style. So what I mean by the brush doing its job. So you notice that I'm not doing, when I say I'm creating those crescents, I'm not doing this. I'm not drawing the crescent and then painting it in. I'm utilizing the angle and the thickness of my brush to create that crescent on its own without having to color it in like with crayons or a colored pencil, you know? So that's what I mean when I say get the brush to do its job. That's what I mean by that. And so you can also, in preparation for this rosette style, you can also sort of just practice these crescents or smiles. Sort of adding a wiggle in there. All right, so I'll do another one down here. So I saw a question about the green. I'm actually not mixing my green. So oftentimes, today I'm going straight from, for sake of time, I'm just working straight from the bottle. That's a really good point to bring up. I do like to mix most of my colors. Like a lot of times I'll even add just a tiny bit of green to my red. I mean, tiny bit. Just to make my work look more cohesive. Sometimes these colors can look really artificial straight out of the bottle, and when we're painting these natural subjects, we want them to be a little more subdued, right? I will say though that sap green within itself kind of just does the job. Like I don't find that I have to mix a lot with my sap green. Sap green is also probably one of my favorite paint colors of all time. Sap green and Payne's gray. I'm going to break out the Payne's gray here in a second. It's like when we go over greenery. So similar to the daisy, the thickness with which you paint your, and so you'll note that I'm leaving these white spaces, okay? Because those white spaces act just as much like a drawing as a negative space as the actual paint and brush strokes that we're putting on the paper, okay? So they are important. If we lose that, then here, I'll lose it for us, I don't mind. Then what happens? Wah wah. The drawing goes away. Did that make anybody uncomfortable? I'll start another one. One of the reasons, we'll go like a little throwback time. One of the reasons I started doing watercolor is because, so I have obsessive compulsive disorder, which, you know, like any mental illness has its downsides and some upsides, I would argue. And And so I used to paint really hard-edged acrylic paintings, and I started doing watercolor just to help my brain to loosen up, and fell in love with it. I will say that, I'm just getting some more paint, y'all. I will say that perfectionism, like with a lot of things, is sort of the antithesis of watercolor. The more precious you come to your canvas, the more precious your mark making, sort of the harder time you're gonna have. And that's where, like the times when I just did a collection of wildflower paintings recently, just for fun, just for me. And I ended up selling most of them. And they just turned out really sweet. And I think one of the reasons they turned out as well as they did and were received as well as they were by an audience was because I came to them with more curiosity and fun. And so, you know, some of my work definitely ends up in the recycling bin. And sometimes it goes in the recycling bin, and then the next day I come and pull it out of the recycling bin because I was having a bad day, and I think, you know, I've got fresh eyes and a new perspective, and I think, oh, actually that work wasn't so bad, and it gets pulled back out of the recycling bin. So much I think of art making, and with watercolor in particular, is like the mood you're in that day. I do have a hard time painting if I'm not in the mood per se, or if I'm not in a good headspace. Usually I don't produce good work on that day, or the work that I need to. I do a lot of client work, and so, you know, those aren't the days I'm going to paint for clients, definitely. And so that is the rosette style. What I do see a lot, I'll sort of do, sometimes students will make this curly Q and they sort of leave too much white space, and then they do 3 things like that. And so if yours is looking sort of like this, which it very well may be, it happens every class, it just means that you need to tighten up your brush strokes a little bit, and also sort of let them be a little bit more organic. And also it's okay, because this is just practice, and we're just having a good time here today. If I can sort of fill that in. All right, so I want to go ahead and move on to Greenery so that we have enough time to go over it. So those are my rosettes. And let's see here. So a lot of times I don't think I'm going to do it right now, but I save all these pieces and I utilize the backs for practice. So that's just another like hack, especially when you're, you know, you buy this paper and then you're just using it for practice or whatever. It's still valuable, but like it's nice to use those backs. So let me grab another sheet. So this is actually, I'll just show you real quick. This is actually the paper I'm using right now. This student grade paper. Canson makes it. It's this blue. It's kind of hard to miss, this blue front. This is also the same paper that comes in my kits. It's nice and thick. It's 140 pounds. It has a little bit less of a texture to it, but it does the job. So when I'm doing, while I'm on the subject, when I'm doing work for portraits and things, I like this Fabriano paper. It is also cold pressed. It has a little bit more of a tooth to it. Arches paper is kind of like the best in air quotes, but I actually don't love it. I like this Fabriano paper better, which is great because it is cheaper. So there's some paper info for you. All right, so let's talk about Greenery. So spoiler alert, leaves and petals look very similar. So in the same vein that we created all those different petal shapes, when you do it in green, it's now a leaf. So once again, I'm using the 2-stroke method. so I can do a longer, thinner leaf. I can do a shorter, wider leaf. So here's where greenery gets fun. So if you do, we're gonna make sort of a sprig here. So basic sprig. So just one line down the center and then some veining down the sides. Okay, so that in itself, we can do variations of that. So if I do lots of lines close together, we have something that looks more like an evergreen or like a fern style. If I put a little pressure on my brush and widen those strokes, I get a totally different look. So once again, similar movements, just changing some thickness, we're just changing the pressure of our brush, but same base, yeah, same base. I guess that's it. Same base strokes. So now, if I do that, then I can maybe just add some leaves on the edges of the strokes. If I loosen my grip a little bit, and I can just sort of add some dots, I can do some like wispy berry-like greenery. Now, if I don't loosen up, then it just looks more stylized. It's just harder to make it look as organic, right? So that's why loosening your hand, even painting with your opposite hand, opposite of your dominant hand, can be helpful. So I'm gonna do one, I'm gonna sort of put it together with the greenery and the flower, and then we're gonna be done, and we're gonna be taking some questions. Let's see. So I'm gonna do, I'm gonna give you my spiel on stems, friends. So a lot of times we will spend all this time working on this lovely flower. We're really proud of this flower and it looks great. It's the best thing we've ever painted. But then we won't take as much time and focus to add that stem, and it ends up looking like a tree trunk at the base of this like nice delicate flower that we've created. And so we want to make sure that we give that stem some focus. And I just put the butt of my hand. See, everybody does it. I'm also working kind of quick here. So we want to make sure that we give that stem some focus, right? And there we are. What we don't want to do, and I don't mind doing it, This is like the rose, it's like more discomfort. Is this number right? Because we're adults now and we have that fine motor control. So I see the question about preparing the palette. So Britt, I actually did that. I went into really detail of that, a lot of detail of that in the very beginning. So you'll be able to watch that in the playback. All right, so that is adding the greenery. So let me show you one more thing. So now that these flowers have dried a little bit, another thing you can do is you can come back in. I'm gonna do it here on this. This is sort of like taking your watercolor to the next level. So one of the benefits of watercolor is the way you can build up layers. So for instance, I do pet portraits. If I'm working on like a dark colored dog, like a black dog, let's say, and I want to keep those highlights, I'm not doing one layer of black paint. I'm doing 15, 25 layers of dark gray. All right, so you can, now that this is dry, so how do we tell if this is dry? So first, visually, if it's shiny, it's still wet, okay? So you can kind of go at an angle like that. Next test is to touch it very lightly. If it's still cool to the touch, it's still damp, okay? So this isn't cool to the touch, this isn't smearing, this isn't going anywhere. So now I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna add another layer of petals. And do you see how I've got some of the other petals showing through? And I just added a whole layer of dimension to that petal, to this flower, I mean. Fun, right? But that can only be achieved if your layer underneath is completely dry. So we are in the last 10 minutes and I want to keep that open for questions. Yeah, but that's basically our lesson for today. And so I'm going to be looking at the chat. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've gone over so far? And I'm gonna zoom back out. And how do you plan compositions? Yeah, so that's a whole lesson honestly in itself. You can always one way is to cut your paper in fours and then have a bunch of small pieces. So that's another way that I like to work as well, because sometimes just looking at this big 9x12 empty space can just be a little bit too daunting. So in that way, sometimes it's just nice to work in small. So sometimes I'll do a really small mini version of what I want my big version to look like. You could also just do a quick sketch in pencil. In my classes that I teach, we don't do a lot of pencil work. We do mostly just straight brush to paper. And a lot of that has to do with one, time, but two, people getting too tight with their work. Awesome. And so that's one way to plan a composition. I definitely go over compositions more in my longer range workshops. I have a workshop tomorrow actually that still has space, by the way. I'm teaching watercolor butterflies. So if you loved this today and you have some time between 2 and 4 tomorrow, I'm gonna go ahead and pop the link to my website into the chat right now. And you can register there. Classes are $30 and you get access to a rewatch afterwards for the life of the class. So there's my website. Yes, and the NCMA will be sending out a link for you to rewatch this as much as you'd like as well. So yeah, let's see what other questions we have. Yeah, so I got the question about lessons. Yeah, anything you'd want to see. That's weird. Me to all panelists. Best paint brands. So my link, I don't know why it didn't come through. All right, give me 1 second. I'm sending it to everybody. So it's just I'll say it verbally too. So it's just www.amyrichardsillustration.com. So the Q&A, if you look down at the bottom of the Q&A, you should be able to see it. Oh, for some reason it came through when NCMA sent it. I don't know. So there it is. Ah, okay. My bad. So only Ollie and I can see your questions. I apologize. I've not done this format before. So I'm answering the questions in real time. So somebody asked about best paint brands. It really is totally up to the user. So I love this Hydrus fine art watercolor. It's the liquid watercolor. It's super, super concentrated and super vibrant. I've been using it now for probably 5 years, and it's the main type of paint that I use. I will say that the most expensive things in watercolor are probably the brushes and the paper. That being said, companies like Dick Blick, Jerry's locally to Raleigh, they have sales all the time. I keep my eye out for sale on these Polar Flow watercolor brushes, but even when they're not on sale, they're not too crazy. But unlike like acrylic paint, which, you know, an acrylic and oil, you might spend $50 on a tube of paint. These little guys, which you can find, Dick Blick, you can even find on drphmartins.com. These run about $10 a bottle, and I maybe go through the green, probably I go through a lot more of, but like maybe 1 to 2 bottles a year. I mean, it really lasts. Do I recommend masking fluid? I actually don't love masking fluid at all. I don't find it particularly easy to use, and I've had issues with it, like getting it up off the paper. So I do, let me see, I do have a masking fluid nearby. So I personally just like don't find that I can control it enough. So a lot of times what I'll use is this bleed proof white and go over and add white. So somebody asked about masking fluid. This is an old bottle of masking fluid. Masking fluid is like a sticky substance like glue. You put it down on the paper and then it masks anywhere you paint over it, and you can kind of pull it up. I don't love it. I actually prefer to just go back and add white usually. And I like Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white. So let's see. So I think my website came across. So there you can access the children's book, you can access my classes, you can access free tutorials, which are just short tutorials on YouTube. But yeah, tomorrow's class is butterflies. I've got a beach landscape class coming up later this month. I will be going back to in-person soon. I'm just working out logistics on that currently as things reopen. Let me see what other questions there are. Sorry about the confusion about the chat. Any other questions? That's the hour. It went by real fast. One of the things that I love about watercolor is how you kind of take it anywhere. It's not super messy, and you can kind of pack it away. Ooh, favorite blue. So my favorite blue, which is not a true blue, is actually called Payne's Gray. And I'll just like show it to you really quick. My goal with my classes is to just make things not pretentious and really, you know, for everyone. I'm of the opinion that if you paint or you make art, you're an artist. Here's the blue that I really like. So it's like a nice smoky blue. I don't have a favorite true blue. Sorry, I can't be more helpful with that. Probably cobalt if I was just going to choose a color, but they're going to look different across brands. Somebody asked a question about paper. What about the paper? We did go over it a little bit, but I'm happy to go over it again. What color green did I use? I used sap green. It's my favorite. One thing I'll say about colors, like sap green is a color of acrylic paint. It's a color across the board. Now, depending on who makes it, like Winsor Newton is another popular watercolor brand in tubes. Their sap green is going to be different than, you know, the sap green that this company makes, right? So you kind of just have to experiment and find what you like. I just love these liquid watercolors so much. As a matter of fact, most of my students have become Dr. P.H. Martin's high-risk like recruits, like they're into it. So let's see. Thank you. Michelle said, I'm a wonderful teacher. Thank you. I love it. And I hope it shows. The hydrous are definitely permanent. Somebody asked if the hydrous watercolors are permanent or if they're light fast, and they're definitely permanent. This class ends now, about now. Let's see. Yes, the hydrous is liquid. It's a dropper and it is liquid. So it's definitely pre-wet. If I was to paint a background, would you paint around your flowers? Thank you for a fun class. So I'm gonna be honest, I don't paint many backgrounds, but I probably would just do a light, quick wash around it. But you could also do a wash across your paper first and then paint the flowers over it. It's really just like an aesthetic decision. Somebody else had another class or another question I wanted to answer that was important. How do you deal with self-doubt in the beginning and middle stages? Okay, so I kind of mentioned this before. I always have self-doubt when I go into watercolor. It's just like any unknown thing. Like I try to just come to it with a lot of curiosity and leave the perfectionism at the door, which is not a natural, it's not my natural state, okay? Like that doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not a easygoing person by nature. It only took me till almost 40 to be able to say that. But you just, honestly, the more you practice, the more comfortable you get holding this brush, the more comfortable you get with being able to eyeball, like if your pigment to water ratio is correct, the more confident you're gonna be. So, yeah, I mean, that honestly, just the doing and showing up for yourself is what breeds the confidence. And like I said, a lot of what I paint ends up in the recycling bin. Like it's not always about creating a finished piece that's going to end up on like a greeting card. I make greeting cards. Yeah, I have a full product line. I guess I didn't mention that, but it's not about something that I may sell later. Like sometimes it's just about the doing, and that's equally as important as creating something for it to be a final piece. So I'm going to take it. I'm going to answer. Oh, thank you. So I'm going to take it off of my camera and put it back on my face. And I'm going to stay on to answer, if Ollie doesn't mind, a couple more questions if we have them. Thank you so much for your kind words. It really means a lot that y'all are here with me today. I don't take that lightly. I don't take your time lightly. And we packed a lot into a very short amount of time, but I'm just grateful you were here with me today. And does anybody have any more questions? I think with the self-doubt, it's just that repetition. It's getting back on that bike. It's, you know, sometimes painting when you don't feel like it, maybe just doing a little exercise. It's keeping that muscle memory in tune. It has been a year. Somebody said it's been a year. It definitely has. Have access to, yes, you will be emailed by the museum access to this class later. Haha, show us some of your work. So you can go to, actually, I'm like, none of the work behind me is mine. It's all other artists. But if you go to my website, which is just amyrichardsillustration.com, you can see my Etsy shop link. You can see my pet portraiture, the children's book I just finished. I've gotten really good feedback about my Florals book. If you like the way I broke things down here, the Florals book is the same. All of that can be found on my website, and I'm just grateful for you all. So I hope you had some fun today and made something that, you know, made you feel good. So, and Ollie, I didn't know if there was anything you wanted to add. Thank you for your thank yous.
No, and I guess with that, we're going to end the recording and end the demo.
Thank you, friends. Thank you, Ollie. Thank you, North Carolina Museum of Art, and everybody have
Thanks,
fun.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.